We had a big news today with Mr. McClellan. So I assume, given the lofty purpose of this course, we won't discuss any of that.
Yeah, we might. It might come up. Well, the course is The President, the Press, and Democratic Society. And we're trying to grapple.
In which order?
All together. They're not opposed to one another. So we're trying to figure out what kind of information people need in a democracy. You know, ideally, it would seem that the public should be able to have whatever it wants. What do you think, from working in a White House? What do you think ideally people need, and what are the impediments?
Well, a great phrase that sticks in my mind is in an essay that Joe Nye wrote not long ago in Foreign Affairs magazine. Joe Nye was the dean of the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard. And in the passing and making an argument about something else, he said, we live in an era now with a plenitude of information but a paucity of understanding. Mm-hmm. I think we clearly have got abundant information that is available. It's not as accessible as it needs to be, but also how you put that information in some coherent, orderly, structured environment so citizens can access it is a real problem. Now this is that's an open-ended question, and it allows me to filibuster a little bit, but the point of my filibuster would be this. Yeah. We do not have an ethic of public information in our government right now. We don't have a commitment to the public's right to know and a commitment to make available and transparent the inner workings of government so that citizens can see for real what's going on. And that is a big problem. It means that there's distrust of the processes of government. There's a belief that special interests and lobbyists and influential donors have a greater say in the processes of democracy than I believe that they do. And I think part of the problem, part of the reason for that is because White Houses and governments and politicians try to structure this information in a way that gives them some political advantage. The shorthand term for that is spin, that you try to shape the story, spin the story so that it comes out to your advantage politically. And that is what has caused great concern among the public and the press about this whole adversarial relationship between the press and the politician. Is it about getting accurate, truthful information to the public, or is it about, you know, this feisty relationship back and forth in which a game is apparently being played? And I think today, the day being that we've spent talking about the news related to the current White House press secretary, it's a good day to rethink the whole function of the press secretary and the role that the public information function should be in government. Mm-hmm. I think we probably need to make it a career position, or at least have a career function that many agencies do have, in which more information is made available to the public, and there needs to be some systematic way in which that information is structured and presented so that people can easily get what they're looking for. You know, first gov.gov or whatever,
WhiteHouse.gov?
OneGov.gov is not as effective as it ought to be, and the technologies and the communications processes that we have that could make it more information available are not being employed. Look, we rely on some guy standing at a podium the same way we would have done it in the 1900s to convey information about the workings of the president, and that's just not sufficient given the information age that we're in. So it's a long answer to say that the public needs more factual, accurate information that they can use so that they can form their own opinions. What we have now is instead is an opinion society in which a lot of people are force-feeding opinions to them and trying to, you know, make them believe certain things before they've had an opportunity to think. And I think that's not a good place to be in if you're concerned about the democratic process.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think part of that is the partisanship that's grown up. And is that a function of a White House, or is that the Washington community as a whole? What has driven that?
Well, two things have driven it. One is partisanship, which has grown fiercer and more bitter and more polarized during the 1990s. This was not, as it turns out, just because people didn't like Bill Clinton or thought he was too much of a baby boomer. It was, I think, in some ways structured into our system. There was nothing left at the end of the day that would force any modest bipartisanship in the system. During the Cold War years, we had Democrats and Republicans would work together because we would have, bipartisanship in foreign policy, and I think that then taught people to work out ways to be together. Plus, we had a period of, in the 60s and 70s, a period of legislative dominance in which Congress was writing laws and trying to impact major social problems through legislation and, in many cases, kind of coaxing presidents along. So there was an era of legislative branch dominance, and I think the power has shifted a little bit now back more to the presidency. The second thing, though, is the impact of all these robust technologies of communication that make everyone a writer, an editor, an opinion author instantaneously, because everyone can self-publish. And that's not only taken away the influence of what we would call the mainstream old media, but it's also, I think, created less coherence in our political system, so that everyone can spout off an opinion and be angry and get out and rant, but that nobody is held accountable for coming together and figuring out how do you compromise at the end of the day and begin to rebuild alliances that will solve problems. And so as we've been stuck at 50-50 in our partisan divide, nothing has happened. Gridlock has sort of taken over Washington, and our systems are largely dysfunctional. So this is a part of a serious problem. Our democracy arguably is not functioning very well right now, because major problems that we need to address, social problems, how we're going to handle the enormous demographic changes that are taking place in our society, we're absent any coherent process to wrestle those problems to the ground and bring about solutions. And that's cheating the American people, I think.
What period do you think represents a time when the people did get better information, were better informed, and that the system worked more effectively?
Well, moments of crisis tend to take game playing out of the system. So immediately post 9/11, you saw a coming together of people, a real serious effort by the press, politicians, and others to set aside partisan differences and really get down to business. Now that lasted, the Mike McCurry rule is that major events hold in the public imagination for about 90 days, and then they begin to evaporate. And in fact, that is true. Remember the great war on poverty that we were all committed to fighting post-Katrina? That kind of evaporated in about 90 days. If you go back and look post 9/11, great bipartisanship, people hugging each other in the Rose Garden, leaders pledging to work with each other to, confront terrorism. But by January of 2002, the front page of the Washington Post, as Congress came back to session in 2002, was, partisan gridlock returns to Washington, not much chance for progress on legislative agenda, leaders say. I mean, that almost literally was the headline. So those are periods in which you get moments of true crisis where the country rallies together and feels like they have to pull together as one nation. You get that dynamic. But we get very little of that nowadays. Now, I guess going back in time, I mean, I feel increasingly older and older, particularly when I've got students in front of me. It's now 30 years since I first came to Washington to work as a press secretary. And in the 1970s, people really did have some sense that we set aside partisan differences when it comes time to really get serious about doing business. And the provision of information was easier. Why? Because we had three dominant networks. 85% of the electorate got their news every night from the three networks, or most of their news from the networks. So it was kind of a common campfire that the country gathered around in order to get on the same page. And in a way, keeping people well informed, getting folks involved in whatever the public discourse was easier, because you had several dominant players that really set the tone for most of the media, and we just don't have that now. We have, it's a much more vibrant, small d democratic environment, but it's also less coherent.
Do you think that that a president still can get to the public when he has something that he wants to discuss and that he's listened to?
Well, that's a darn good question. And you may know more about this than I do sitting here. But President Bush has, over the course of the past 2 or 3 months, consistently gone out and taken these little road trips to take his program coming out of the State of the Union to select places around the country. Now, my guess is he does very well when he shows up in those places, getting information in front of the citizens that he wants them to see. I mean, I think his message gets through, but it is very sporadic, and it kind of depends. It's certainly splintering any sense of a national audience there, because the national audience just kind of hopscotches around whatever is the news cycle that the national press focuses in on any day. So I'm not sure that the president has as big a bully pulpit as the president has had in the past. Or maybe another way to say it is that the traditional bully pulpit is not as effective, and presidential communications need to be rethought. And I think that may be more interesting. What is interesting is that clearly politically, in the course of the campaign in 2004, the current White House did rethink the way in which you deliver a message to the electorate anticipating an election coming up. I think they created a grassroots army of communicators who really went out and helped organize and deliver a very effective message at the local level. And I often say that they kind of ran, in that sense, they ran the first campaign of the 21st century. We ran a very good campaign in the McCurry campaign. It just happened to be the last campaign of the 20th century, because we were relying on more of these techniques that are associated with the old media, the old style of politics. And meanwhile, they had sort of leapfrogged and moved into a new era and figured out how to do it. Now, they have not taken that model of grassroots communication and married that up with the challenge of governing, which I think is interesting. But that's where, my guess is that's where presidential communications will head, that you'll have not one press secretary, you'll have millions of them who will be out in the communities talking about what the president's program is, sort of fully deputized and empowered to be part of the message delivery mechanism that I think a modern president and a modern political movement will need.
Except you can really only have one person who's speaking.
No, you can have, you can have many people's, many voices, one message.
Yeah.
Many people
but an
empowered to
authoritative
speak.
voice.
If that's the real question, the authoritative voice. I think you go and ask most Americans, the media is not, the New York Times is not the authoritative voice. CBS News is not the authoritative voice, not even Fox News.
Yeah, but I just mean the authoritative voice from the White House.
Well,
somebody's speaking for the president.
If you've got a little button that says you're a White House communicator, and you're in a neighborhood PTA meeting, or you're the deputized person, you might be very authoritative. If you're a person respected, well-known in that community, and you're communicating one-on-one with people in that audience, you're as reliable as you are as an individual spokesman. But that person could have enormous sway over an audience. That's exactly how I think the Bush campaign organized itself to go out and win the campaign in 2004. But my point is, I think that may be where presidential communications is headed. And then you in effect, you don't need one person standing at a podium at the White House making pronouncements, because you've got 6 million people out in the countryside doing exactly that.
Saying 6 million things, though.
Well, no, I mean, you have to.
Aren't you going to have trouble with them?
You'd have to be disciplined, and everyone would have to know what are they supposed to say on behalf of the president. But this current White House proves that you can be very disciplined and be very good when it comes to delivering that kind of message.
Do you
And
think
it also, by the way, would then be a way in which communities could interact with that person and send feedback to the White House. There's no mechanism now. You can pick up your New York Times or your Washington Post, but you can't give the president a shout-out. But you would be able to do it if his designated representative had the assignment of coming and doing a briefing in your community once a week. It's an interesting idea. Some people would say, what's the role of the elected representative, the member of Congress? Because the president presumably only presents his side of the story, and then there's obviously a different branch of government. But I think we may be entering a time in which there's considerable change in the way in which people think that they get, who do they rely on to get their information that they use to make important decisions about what they believe and what decision they think is right and what the right kind of policy is.
Do you think that the discipline, you seem to think that discipline has worked very well in their favor. Can you discuss the ways it has and the ways that it has harmed them?
Well, I think on the plus side, it has made it easier for them. Remember, looking back now over almost 6 full years of the presidency, it has served them pretty well in controlling a storyline along the lines that they wanted the story told. It's been only recently in which things have not functioned as well for them. They have been able to define a set of objectives. They have been able to define the president's priorities. They've been able to locate and deliver messages to supporters and build some support for their program. And they've done classically the things that the White House tries to do when it communicates. And they've also not had a lot of the negative kind of stories that come about when you have a lot of people talking out of school. When you've got people commenting on the process. They have been much more focused on the substance of the policy that they're trying to deliver to the American people and less discussion around the theatrics or the infrastructure or the process behind the curtain, which I think is commendable. Now, that said, they're dealing with a press corps at the White House, as you know, that just chafes under this type of discipline and who, now show day by day that they're not willing to live under that kind of structured regimen any longer. So that when something happens, like Dick Cheney shoots up a hunting buddy, the story lingers for days and days because the press is basically saying to the White House, we're going to get even and we get to decide when the story turns to something else, not you. And I think the president, as he struggled in the midst of being in a pretty bad shape politically and has tried to do various things to change the dominant storyline, has not had as much success because there's frankly no goodwill there. And they haven't done those little things necessary to, even when they are trying to be disciplined and very taut in the way in which they deliver message, they haven't done those things that actually make it an amicable relationship.
Right.
And I think Scott McClellan, to his credit, has tried to do some of that, but I don't think that it's commonly perceived among the press that this is a press-friendly White House.
No, I just say
And
that's true.
they pay a huge price for that. So I think that the idea is disciplined delivery of message that helps the president get his program in front of the people, but done in a way that recognizes and respects the very important role that the press plays. I think in many ways, this White House has paid a huge price for a comment that Andy Card made and probably made inadvertently to Ken Aletta, a writer for New Yorker magazine, when he said something to the effect that the press really is nothing more than another interest group, and they shouldn't have any standing in the process that's ahead any other group that's got an interest in the debate, and that's just not the right way to think of this, because it truly is the fact that the press has to be there as a surrogate for we the people, because 300 million people can't descend on the White House to demand answers every day. Now, I understand part of my argument is we have to make it easier for those 300 million Americans to access information from the White House every day, but that's what we could do if we were smarter about technologies and smarter about how we make important information useful to citizens.
Do you think that in their discipline, that one of the problems for them was that they focused on carrying out that message, and in whatever they've been, whether it was personal retirement accounts or whatever, and that at the same time it was difficult to listen, that if you're going to be disciplined, that you have to just bore through no matter what, and that advocating and listening tend to be very difficult to do at the same time.
I think that's right. And I also think in the internet age that we're in now, communication is interactive. And the model has to be a two-way model, that it's a call and respond system where, unless you're having a conversation with the recipient of the information, you're not really creating dialogue. And that's we still have one-way communication by and large coming from Washington. Politicians stand up, give speeches, expect people to read and look at it, but we're not entering into the kind of creative dialogue that's possible given the technologies we have now. I mean, why not? Why should a press corps sitting in a room like this be the only ones that get to ask the question of the press secretary every day, when you could easily make it possible for people to send their email their questions in and take them online and do all kinds of other things? It would be interesting and give people give them a feeling of true participation.
Well, you have that with Ask the White House, that you have people doing that, but not in a
you do, but
press
I don't think it's
briefing.
it's not done in a fashion that looks real. That people think that there is a real process here by which I get to put my question in and hold people accountable.
Right. That it might be a setup as to who,
Yeah.
where those questions come from.
Right.
When you were press secretary, how did you see the public's role?
Well, I tended to define the public's role through the prism of the press corps that was there, because I took seriously the notion that that press corps was a surrogate for the American public, that they were the only, because we couldn't invite the entire American public into the White House to do the questioning, that we had to rely on representatives of the people who were there in the form of the media that reported directly to the American people. And I think that's an arguable proposition now, as the press becomes ever more opinionated, as it becomes more and more political, becoming more prone to be adversarial and to advocate positions. Advocacy journalism, or opinion journalism, as Michael Kinsley called it, recently becoming more the norm now than the exception. I don't know whether you can legitimately say that that gathering of press that comes to the White House every day is representative of the American people. And particularly because a lot of the largest news organizations that have the biggest audiences and the biggest circulation don't participate in that event because they don't find it useful. So again, that's, I think, a symptom of a public information function that's not working.
Well, one of the things that happened was that once that briefing became televised,
well, they had to shoot the idiot who decided that it ought to be televised.
So once, we'll bring Cheney in, once that it did, then you had come into the White House a lot of people who have their own interests, their own issues, because you see a real difference in the morning meeting with the press, which is known as the gaggle. There are different cast of characters that comes than in the afternoon. So the major papers and the major players are much more likely to come to the gaggle than they are to the briefing.
But if you're showing it because it's a televised event, that's an opportunity to hawk whatever your cause is or your issue is. Or I agree with that. The other problem, the other mistake that we made in the Clinton White House when we didn't put rules on the broadcast of the briefing was that we should not have said that the thing is open to immediate live coverage, because it's a news briefing. It's the raw ingredient of news there, and it's not, the audience is not getting the benefit of the finished product that comes at them when good reporters have taken whatever information comes at that briefing, put it through an editorial filter, tested the information against other sources, had discussions with editors who actually put some oversight into what is reported and not reported, and then put together a coherent, interesting, readable, viewable, listenable product. What you're getting is just a raw ingredient. And you know, when a reporter is sitting at a White House press briefing like David Gregory does and badgers the press secretary, that's a reporting technique. It's designed to see how unnerved will the press secretary become, because that's an indicator of how sensitive the particular topic is. It's not because the reporter's being mean or vicious. It's just because that's the style of reporting that's being done. Well, you know, an audience watching that live doesn't understand any of that. That's not part of the vocabulary that the audience is familiar with. And I think it was just a bad mistake to allow live transmission of the briefing. If we had said, welcome to use any of this in whatever fashion you want to use for your reporting later, they could have come back and played clips or snippets, but the you know, endless questioning probably would have made it to the air.
Well, at one time, there were 2 briefings a day, and they occurred to match the deadlines of the AM and PM newspapers. And so there was real information that was provided in those briefings. What's happened in recent years is that with a 24-hour news cycle, that the White House is giving out information all the time.
Right.
And so by the time that you get to the briefing, there is really no information to hand out. So you have an explosive situation because you have no information but a press corps that's waiting for something, and so they're going to bore in.
Well, you have a press corps there, though, that is no longer reporting hard news. It's actually analyzing the news and putting it in context, because it's trying to provide to the consumers that missing context that we have. When we have a plenitude of information, we need some way of putting it in a coherent structure. And that gets back to where I think we need to change and rewrite some of these rules. Now, on the side of journalism, the business, if the government public information function is seriously broken, so is the business model of most major news organizations, because, you know, they're not making money putting ink on paper and plopping it on your doorstep for 35 cents a day. They're not making it by selling advertising in and around the broadcasts they do, because audiences are in decline, circulation is in decline. And part of the problem and reason why we are skeptical about much journalism is they are still trying to compete based on speed. And we keep seeing example after example after example that the faster you report, the less reliable the information will be, because it hasn't been tested and verified and, you know, determined to be authentic. That's why we have, you know, miners miraculously surviving disasters who actually, in fact, are dead.
Yeah.
And that, you know, undermines the trust that the public needs to have in journalism. Now, my argument to many editors, publishers, owners of journalistic properties is they need to rewrite the basis of competition so it's not speed. It's not based on getting the scoop, getting the headline first, you know, getting the breaking news. It's getting depth, substance, usefulness, creative and compelling presentation of important information, you know, telling people things that they need to know in ways that really draw them in and make them want to interact with the news and become, you know, concerned and take action. I mean, that is, I think, the hallmark of great journalism. It's always been the hallmark of great journalism in America, but we're just not getting a lot of it because they're still trying to make an old business model work. And they haven't invented the new 21st century business model. But when Google and the New York Times eventually merge then maybe we'll get a different we'll get a different news product. But
Do you think that in a briefing that what you could do, because I know you think that it should be disbanded altogether, but what about having a briefing where you bring in people to explain policy?
well, I facetiously said they ought to ban the current briefing because I think that's less useful. But I do think two things have to happen. One, the basic raw information that resides in government has to be more accessible to the American people in whatever fashion that can be done. And one would be to create real respected career civil servants whose job it is to make that information available every day. And they become the experts in government. They're the ones that come in and do briefings regularly for the press. It would recreate the beats in journalism in which individual policy areas or agencies were covered regularly. It used to be there was an agriculture press corps and Commerce Department press corps. I mean, all the agencies of government were more or less covered by specialist reporters who understood the workings of those agencies. That disappeared, in the 80s and 90s, and so now all that information more or less funnels through the White House and to a lesser degree the State Department and the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. But it mostly all the reporting on government kind of comes through that prism at the White House with a press corps that's not equipped to cover all the different complexities of policy in all those various agencies. So you've had a rise of the specialty press, trade press, the kind of the niche market publications that cover specialized areas, and yet I think that cheats the average citizen out of things that really give you a better sense of what's happening in government every day. But you could bring experts from these various cabinet departments in to do briefings. You could make more information online. You could some government agencies have absolutely first-rate websites. The CIA actually being a very good example, NASA being a good example. I think more could be done to make information interesting and available on the web that could be used by citizens. So it just we need to reinvest in the resources, the people, the systems that will recreate this public information function. That's, I guess, when it comes down to me, that's what we have to be thinking about.
What is the responsibility of the citizen to dig out information?
Well, that's a good question because, the citizen now, increasingly as a new business model gets developed, will be able to custom order the news that you get every day. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a dangerous exercise if it only is the titillating or the narrow interest that the citizen defines for himself or herself. Says, well, I'm not interested in all this other stuff, just give me this, this, and this every day. That's what my custom tailor-made information product ought to be that's delivered to me in my computer or PDA or iPod every day. But that's then the challenge to journalism, which has historically found creative, exciting, important ways to make really important information accessible. Mm-hmm. I mean, the example I always say is, I think this is right, that nobody probably would have asked to be told about slaughterhouses, but Upton Sinclair figured out how to write about it in a very compelling way and made it something that you could not turn away from, that you had to pay attention to. And that's classically been what great journalism has been about in America. So I think that's what the journalists of the 21st century, the people who are in journalism schools today, will be creating those kinds of information products for delivery. And along the way, they will be able to take things that are truly important and make them accessible. We don't, on college campuses around the country, people care about and work hard to do something about the genocide in Darfur. But I think that a problem has been we haven't had vivid journalism there because it's dangerous, among other things, that really compellingly brings that story to us on a regular basis so that we have to do something about it. I mean, that's when we finally react to or respond to human tragedy and disaster, it's because someone has been keeping the story burning long enough that someone says we got to do something about this. I mean, that's what the greatest failing of the Clinton administration, and President Clinton has said this himself, was not to respond to the genocide in Rwanda. Part of the reason I don't think we did was because CNN wasn't there reporting.
New York Times was, and there was a lot that was written about what was going on.
That's true. There has always been. You can never accurately say the press ignored this story because there are always plenty of examples of good journalism done. But this is another thing where I disagree with journalists. In politics, we communicate through repetition, through constant reinforcement of message, through pounding something home every day. That's why the dominant form of communication in politics right now is the 30-second spot, although I, by the way, believe that's going to change too. But it's that reinforcement and repetition that helps drive the story through the clutter and get it to the citizen. That is the 180-degree opposite definition that a journalist would use to define news. News is, I tell you, it's no longer news because you've heard it, so we move off to another subject. And, but to have impact, to really drive the story home, the journalist has to figure out how to compete with everything else out there and repeat the news night after night and keep writing about it in a compelling way. It's kind of why I think that's why Nick Kristof won a Pulitzer Prize, because he found interesting, important ways to keep coming back to a subject that was not being paid attention to and make it compelling. And we get very little journalism like that. We get a 6-part series in the Washington Post that nobody reads because it goes on interminably, and then the Post thinks that it's done a great service because it's covered the story, but it hasn't figured out how to bring people back to it night after night after night, so that they have to pay attention
and use that story again as a jumping off point for others. Like a good, there were a couple of really good stories. Series before Christmas. One in the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, Susan Glasser story that was 2-part. That was really very interesting about how the administration functions.
When they get interested, I mean, not to get personal about it, but when they get interested, they can take a story and create an ongoing audience for the story. That was the Monica Lewinsky story. I mean, day after day after day, they found some new angle to keep coming back to the same story because, why? It was about sex and about the president and about power and about misuse of power, and so it was an interesting story.
And also, they came back because all the information wasn't put together and dumped at one time. So, like, say, on some of the things, like the fundraising scandals, you all put together 500 pages, documents, and let everything out at one time.
And even though that I think was only marginally successful in controlling a story, but look, it was about scandal. It was anything about scandal, anything about confrontation, anything that kind of looks more exciting than the normal process of government. The press can jump on that and make that compelling and keep coming back to it. But my argument is they cheat the citizen by not giving us that same kind of compelling argument day after day about what are the consequences of not acting on federal budget deficits, of leaving people uninsured without health care, of not combating extreme poverty around the globe, of not dealing with the ways in which you kind of use American force creatively in the world. I mean, you can think of a laundry list of things that are really critical issues that the press doesn't provide that same kind of reinforced coverage day after day. So that the citizen can, finally get to the point they say, okay, I really see why this is an important issue.
But also, the citizen wants to read about
but look, I get this argument all the time. I mean, you say, oh, well, we don't put as much foreign policy coverage in the newspaper now because we know from our reader surveys that the readers won't read it, and we drive our audience away, and we can't make any money doing that. And I said, well, then you're not doing your job well enough. You have to be making that information more compelling so that people will read it and pay attention. They will. I'm convinced that good reporting about these subjects that's done powerfully will draw people into subjects that they might not otherwise pay attention to. I may be just hopelessly Pollyannish about that, but I do think people will pay attention. I don't think it's just the elites that are smart enough to read about global events and have an opinion. I think average citizens will too if they are given a way and kind of a way to attach themselves to the story in some fashion.
Who does it well? What news organization does that well?
Actually, I think there are good examples all over the place often of that kind of coverage. I think the post-Katrina broadcast coverage from New Orleans was an example of that. I think that our major, well-regarded and highly respected news organizations do that on a regular basis. I think the news organizations that kind of fail us a bit are the ones that are basically trying to make money economically by putting two people on a stage and letting them scream at each other and turn a camera on, because that's low-cost journalism. So the people who do it well are the ones that actually invest in going out and finding the story and making it compelling. So they have budgets that allow them to send reporters hard to find places, and they give people the time necessary to explore and write and research on a topic and then present it in a compelling way. That's you have to invest in that kind of reporting, and that's hard to do for news organizations that aren't making money.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are not making money.
Well, let's go to some questions. Towson?
Wake up, Towson.
Okay.
Yes. I was going to ask, what do you think the Bush administration needs to do now to change its reputation as an anti-press administration?
Well, Dr. Kumar is very good at pointing out that White House press operations reflect the attitude and preferences and attitudes of the president. So part of this is going to have to be a change of attitude by President Bush himself. He's going to have to understand that you need to engage the press. You need to be more forthcoming. You have to have people who are responsible, who will stand up and account for themselves publicly. And I frankly just don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's their MO, and that's not the way this president thinks about the press. But I think the larger problem that the president has is one of, is the very difficult position he's in politically. And I don't know how he makes that situation better for himself. There's not a lot of evidence that the economy, though it is strong, is really producing real benefits for average wage earners in America. No evidence that any of the big ticket problems that he said that he was going to try to address, from Social Security to health care to other questions, are really going to get addressed with much progress over the course of the next several years. And the one thing that he should do, which he refuses to do, is to realize you can't govern with just one hand. You're going to have to bring both hands together, and that means reaching out to the Democrats and doing something that begins to build real bipartisan compromise and progress. And they won't do that. If they did that, they would instantly have a better relationship with the press, because there'd be something going on to cover. I mean, part of the reason why they're in a bad place with the press is there's simply not enough news at the White House, because there's not much going on.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a tendency that's difficult to get over of presidents to believe that they have communications problems when in reality they have political and policy problems?
Right.
And how do you break through that?
It's every president wants to believe if people just understood better what it was they were trying to do and the purpose of their policies, that everyone would be on board and there wouldn't be a problem. And that's why they are simply astounded that the press won't report accurately what they're trying to do, because if everyone understood what they were trying to do, surely there would be 100% support for the policy. And what it misses is that sometimes the policy is wrong. Sometimes it's not well executed, and people are not doing what they should be doing. And sometimes your theory or your ideology doesn't generate the kind of benefits and results that you think. And that's exactly where this presidency is right now. They've made a series of very bad choices when it comes to tax policy, how to use the resources of government wisely to improve the condition of the American people, how to conduct a war, and how to prevent future wars. They just have had a series of, frankly, bad decision making, and when you don't hold anyone accountable for that, it shows that you at some level still have faith in the process.
I was thinking of the Social Security and the personal retirement accounts, and the president had a campaign of 60 stops in 60 days.
Yeah.
And when you looked at the support for the concept of personal retirement accounts, that after he had been on the road for 60 days, there was less support for personal retirement accounts than there was at the beginning. I mean, the polls showed that.
It's because the more people heard about the plan, the more concerned they were that it would not generate the kind of benefit they thought they were entitled to or had been promised under the system. The more they realized, which is true, that the risk was being shifted away from the government entitlement program that they had access to currently to a new system in which more of the risk was placed on them because they'd have to be more responsible for their own decision making. Now, I happen to believe that some element of privatization or means testing is necessary in our social insurance program. So I'm probably way to the right of most Democrats and probably more in agreement with President Bush. But the two things that are true: one, they've I think failed to make the argument in a way that would help people understand what a true retirement income security system would look like under the new scheme of privatization. And the second thing, and this is the far more important one, he didn't campaign on it. He spent 2/3 of the money that they spent communicating with the American people via television and advertising to demonize John Kerry. The 1/3, by the way, then 1/3 of the money that was used for a more positive message on his behalf for his reelection in 2004 was spent to put Laura Bush on television saying good things about her husband. So, that's a consequence of you can only govern effectively if you've tried to use your campaigning to build consensus or build an agenda or build some muzzle velocity for the direction you want to lead the country, and they failed to do that. Now, there's a long list, believe me, a long list of failures you would attach to the Democratic side.
Every president running for re-election does the same thing. They try to run on the past rather than risk losing people on policy.
In 1996, when President Clinton ran, remember, this was very, very important. A critical moment when we were having a hard time sort of encapsulating the great corpus of things that he would talk about. Bill Clinton would go out and talk and have a wonderful, things. Here's what we've been doing, here's what we're going to do, and here's what we need to do, and it was wonderful to listen to and very interesting and compelling. But you couldn't kind of boil it down to one shorthand way of understanding what is the guy about at the end of the day. Finally, towards the end of the campaign, Bob Dole gave his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention and talked about how, given his history of heroic service in World War II, he could be a bridge to the great generation of the past, the World War II generation. And Clinton watched that and hit the table when he was watching the speech and said, "That's wrong. That's wrong. You can't. It's not about being a bridge to the past. It's about being a bridge to the future." A bridge, and so that kind of grew in. Let's build a bridge to the 21st century, and it became the idea that we had to do a set of things in order to get America prepared to compete in the global economy of the 21st century. It gave him a framework to make an argument about the future, not turning around and looking at the past. And I don't think we ever got that from George Bush during the course of the 2004 campaign. Now, believe me, and I've said this before, I know that if you put visionary, inspirational leadership into Google, you won't get John Kerry either. I mean, I will stipulate that. But, these are really critical questions that we have to ask about where we want the country to be. What kind of country do we want to be? What kind of sacrifices are going to take of all of us to generate the kind of results that we want if we want this country to be effective in taking on its global leadership role. And we don't have politics oriented to those kinds of questions, that kind of debate. And that's what that's what we need. And my argument is if we had more of this raw public information available to the public, they would insist on hearing more of that kind of debate. So I think it's a case where we're obviously being cheated by politicians who don't address the issues, but I think we are being cheated by a press that won't continue to press for that kind of dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How would that change? You were talking about, how would that change? Is this on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're talking about the future and about the future of communications and more specifically the press secretary. Setting up, hundreds, possibly thousands inside the United States, who have the direct message of the president. First of all, how do you manage something like that? And second of all, how do you curb the leaks, and how do you give an authoritative presence to those people? I mean, because you're sort of going on a theme of building the bridge to the future here.
Yeah.
And how does that happen? And does the president get lost in this? And does the legislature get lost in this, state and federal, in these states? Because then you have, it seems to be kind of not very cohesive. Mm-hmm. And how do you keep that with the same presidential message?
Look, I think we will need to play with my model, and I confess that part of that is sort of put up as a straw man to provoke the argument. I do think, though, that if you, I'll tell you what I was told by friends of mine who worked at the RNC. That in the 2004 campaign, they built this network of 6 million kind of grassroots leaders who were plugged in via internet to the campaign center every day, and they made an interesting discovery. I think this is fascinating. When they asked people to do this or tried to get them to volunteer, they were not as successful as when they said, we want you to be the local community organizer, but you have to send us $25 to get the leadership kit that will allow you to do this. So when the person actually had to give up something of value in order to become deputized to take on this role, they were much more successful because it was taken much more seriously then. I think that's kind of really interesting.
Yeah.
But then that created a mechanism by which they could get points to those people. They could say, tonight we're going to organize a debate watch party, or tonight we're going to, when the president gives his speech, we're going to all gather and talk about this issue or that. They kind of did almost an equivalent of meetups electronically through their grassroots network. And I think there's something to that. I mean, the press secretary is successful when the press secretary is seen as speaking with the authority of the president because the press secretary is knowledgeable about the thinking of the president. So making the president accessible to this network of communicators so that they feel like they've interacted with the president and can say, I've talked to the president, or I've emailed with the president, or I was on a conference call with the president, so that they speak with authority when they are then taking that role on. That would need to be developed. But I think you would also need to make that person deputized to answer questions and to engage in some debate and to be kind of have spirited dialogue with people who would obviously oppose the president on occasion. And I think it would be, it's a different model. How would you develop that and use it? I don't know, but my point is we've got to think of new things that will re-engage the public and move them away from this very static, formulaic way in which the process is driven now.
One more questions from each place. Towson?
Yes, I'd like to know what you would like people to think of as the Democratic position now going into the fall elections.
Well, I'll give you two answers to that. I'll give you the official Democratic Party answer to that, and then I'll give you the Mike McCurry answer to that. I think Democrats have successfully come together, and this is Democrats. By Democrats, I mean the leadership in the House, the Senate, the party, the governors, the mayors. They've come around a simple proposition that together America can do better. And that's a simple phrase, but it's loaded with some meaning, because together clearly implies that we've got a direction the country is going now that benefits only a very few who are primarily wealthy and who are well-connected and who have benefited primarily from the tax policies of the current president. And if we're going to make this work together, we have got to take those who are living at the very margins of our society and make them feel like they're part of this American dream too. Together, America can do better. America is, I think, one of the most powerful words in all of the vocabulary of politics. And there is nothing that needs to be done faster and better than to restore the idea of America in the world, because the squandering of our reputation as a nation internationally through poor diplomacy is one of the greatest consequences and failures of the current administration. Can do, I like, because can do is we're a can do people. We ought to be optimistic about our ability to solve problems. And Lord knows we can do better than we're doing now. We need to move in a new direction. Together, America can do better is classically a definition of change, which is the argument I think we need to take to the American people in the fall. And around that simple formula, we can talk about all the things that you've seen Democrats starting to talk about now. They did a commendable job recently of providing an agenda for real security. What does a real war on terror look like? What do we have to do to kind of make 2006 a year that we really begin to transition our policy in Iraq? How do we fight a real war on terror that will leave us safer? And then how do we create real economic security in a global economy in which we have to compete more effectively? So we've got Democrats talking about innovation, about better education that prepares our kids for the global economy. And you talk about securing them against some of the forces that are going to buffet the American economy over the next several years. How to protect retirement income security as a baby boom retires, how to protect people who are working at the margins of our society, and if they're working, should not be left in poverty because we have minimum wage rates and other wage rates that are too low. So there's a lot of ways in which we begin to paint a picture of a better, newer America. Now that's what you're going to hear Democrats say often, I hope, over the course of the next several months. I would add something else to the formula, which is Democrats need to be for the common good, that we will only succeed in this country if we figure out how we pull together and bring a very diverse country with lots of different things ebbing and flowing in our culture, bring people together so that they really understand that we are in this struggle to be the America we want to be, the better America. We're in it together. And policies that orient themselves to the common good refuse to give special advantages and privileges to only those who have got special access or special privilege. And I think there's a lot that could be done with that. I personally think that it's a reflection of the kind of values that we need to bring into the public debate. And I don't think Democrats have been as effective as they need to be in arguing more from a premise of moral value about what we do if we're a society that really does look out after the least, the last, and the lost. That would be more my addition to what I think otherwise is an effort that's going to emerge to paint a different picture of America. Mm-hmm. I'll let you all vote on whether you think that's a compelling vision or not, but it's the only one we got at the moment.
A question here? Somebody else? Yeah.
Yeah.
There was anything about Upton Sinclair. It was actually exactly 100 years ago.
Right.
That was published, and I think it was in a very similar environment culturally. That is to say, muckraking being a kind of progressive response to the perception of a crisis in American journalism. That you couldn't trust the press anymore, you couldn't trust anybody anymore, and that seems to me to be the mood that we're in right now. Right. And one looks for a similar resurrection, you might say, of some sort from the Democrats. I think you can't overemphasize, though, the gravity of this problem. I teach at University of California, and one of the things that you see in the university right now is an epidemic of what I would call flat-out cheating and deception, increasingly a culture in which students just don't seem to be as responsive as they used to be to the idea that the fabric of our society is held together by trust. And that when you violate that, you degrade the context in which we all strive to lead our lives and do better. But this thing is, in a terrible way, trickling down, and there's a sort of cynicism. I mean, there's a sense that spin is happening, that it's necessary, then that it's necessary to do it well, then it's imperative that you do it, and the best people are the ones that do it. Do you understand where
I do. You're really on to something. I want to come back. Don't let me forget to talk about Adolf Ochs in a minute, because I want to get back to that. But I do. There are two contrary impulses in the democratic response to the ascendancy of conservatism and the victory that conservatism won post-Barry Goldwater over the last 40 years. One is we have to be as mean and as vicious and as nasty as the Republicans have been in order to advance our arguments. And that is the primal scream that you hear in the blogosphere now from people who say, we're mad as hell at what's happened to our country, we're not going to take it anymore, we got to get candidates who are out there who are going to fight hard, stand for things that will change the direction of our country and not be limp-wristed when it comes to dealing with these issues. I mean, you get that constantly. But there is, I think, an alternative impulse that is compelling and I think optimistic, and that is in lots of different places and ways people are beginning to set aside partisan differences and figuring out where do we work together to solve problems. On abortion, which has been a uniquely divisive issue in our society, a lot of Democrats and Republicans trying to figure out, okay, let's set aside theological disputes on Roe v. Wade or right to life or right, choice, and just figure out how we're going to make abortions rare, because they are always an example of something that has gone wrong. And so we ought to be able to congregate around policies that will actually improve the condition, even if we disagree about, larger questions of life. Another one, marriage, the sanctity of marriage. Well, let's set aside whether we should have, constitutional amendments that define marriage, male and female together, and do something to protect the institution of marriage in a country that's just got a divorce rate that is breaking families down, contributing to poverty, contributing to a lot of other social dysfunction. The One campaign, I happen to be, we can create a unity of evangelicals and people who believe as a question of faith that they ought to do something about extreme poverty and AIDS in other countries because they are called to do so by the gospel, uniting with more liberal, secular, humanitarian groups that have been doing important work in Africa for a long time, with a uniquely charismatic guy, Bono, who happens to be the, singing the ballad that kind of gets everyone inspired to rise up and do things. Environmental stewardship. What are we going to do to protect God's creation, which is, again, a place where you see conservative evangelicals uniting with liberal environmentalists, largely secular. So that's the more hopeful politics. They hate it when you say this, but liberals represented in 2004 21% of the electorate, conservatives 35% of the electorate, but most people were mushy in the middle, 45%, and that number holds up pretty well as you look back over many recent elections. People in America are comfortably in the kind of the middle of the political spectrum, but they don't have politics right now that orient towards solutions that bring that center and make it dynamic. So that's where are we going to go? I gave you the answer about here's what the press secretary is going to do, but where we really are going to go, we're going to get politicians who begin to inspire us and change this country and rise up and kind of reinstill some sense of we can do this and we can go out and create a better future. And that's whoever's going to win the presidency in 2008 will be that kind of candidate, and it could be a Republican and a Democrat, or it could be none of the above. It could be an independent. But it will not be stuck in the same kind of bitter partisan standoff that we've been in now for at least 3 or 4 cycles. We're going to move in a better and more hopeful direction.
Okay.
That's a good
Thank
way
you
to-
very much.